You're traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Filmling Zone. Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast, or the Filmling Zone, whichever you decide to perceive it today.
A weekly podcast or scientific theory where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 46, Amiable Aliens.
That's right, we're talking about a genre today, and a whole entire genre, which is no small task, but it is one that is near and dear to our hearts, especially Jonathan's heart.
And we're since sci-fi is such a huge genre, we're like, we need a through line, and that through line this week is aliens, and happily non-violent aliens, because we could do a whole nother week on bad aliens. Yeah.
I'm sure there's another episode out there about gray area aliens, complicated aliens. Those exist too in spades. It's a big universe potentially full of aliens. We don't really know. But as you may have noticed from the intro today, this is kind of related to our love of Twilight Zone. And while I do really like Twilight Zone, Jonathan really loves Twilight Zone. Approaching the level that Hayden loves the Muppets, if you may have listened to last week's episode. Although I'm not sure anything could quite approach that level. But Jonathan, why don't you tell us, and me, because I don't think I've ever asked this, how did you first get hooked on the Twilight Zone? Where did that obsession come from?
Yeah, it's kind of an odd question that I don't know exactly where it started either. I remember reading The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street in English class in middle school, but I don't think it started there. I think it started with reading Ray Bradbury, especially The Martian Chronicles, and some other books that are anthology stories just in literature. And then The Twilight Zone is a television version of anthology science fiction. And so at some point I decided to sit down and watch them when they were posted on Netflix, and just fell in love with them because sci-fi is something that I've kind of inundated myself with in literature for a very long time. So Twilight Zone is definitely probably my favorite show ever. And it's not to say that every episode is perfect, but there are so many good ones, and it's such the epitomal classic sci-fi that we are going to be talking about it a lot this week.
Yeah, certainly. And to talk about the genre and its history in terms of filmmaking, we have to go all the way back to really the start of film, because it's something that's been around since film has been around, and it's something that has adapted with the times that have come each decade. What's the prominent technology, be it steam technology, steam engines at the start of film, nuclear era science technology from the mid 20th century, even up into today, when we see stuff like Black Mirror with digital technology and virtual reality and stuff like that is prominent in the sci-fi we see. But going way back to 1902, there's the famous George Méliès short film, A Trip to the Moon, which is maybe one of the first sci-fi films ever. It's kind of hard to prove whether or not it is the first sci-fi film ever, since so many films from that time have been lost to the ages, but it's definitely one of the first, most well-known sci-fi films of that era.
Yeah, and sci-fi in every era has its standouts. Sci-fi, when it focuses on the science and the fantasy aspects, is not nearly as compelling as sci-fi that focuses on current events and taking an introspective look at humanity. So we've seen that even on the podcast with things like Metropolis from 1927, where it's definitely sci-fi, but it's also a social commentary. And that's one of the main things we're going to be talking about this week, because each of these films is not a look how great our visual effects are, look how cool this vision of another species can be. It's about what does a something that's other, something that's different than us, what reaction do humans have to that, and what does that say about ourselves?
Yeah, yeah, it's a way to get outside of our own perspectives and see a different perspective, and mash them up and try to get a new perspective. I think that's the Socratic way of speaking: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Or maybe I'm misplacing my Greek thinkers. Who knows? But anyway, the genre kind of really exploded in the mid-century after the nuclear bombs dropped, and that's when you get stuff like our first film today, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and a lot of sci-fi that was based off of nuclear technology and the idea that nuclear power would revolutionize everything in the way we did
Twilight
it.
Zone falls in this era also.
Oh,
This is
deeply
definitely what we
within the era.
call the golden age of science fiction.
Yes, yes, and it's very pulpy, and there's a lot of good stuff, but there's also a lot of kind of cheap money grabs, B movies, a lot of which ended up on Mystery Science Theater 3000, and I'm very thankful for that personally. I love that show. But of course, the genre takes another turn when we get to the space race with the moon landing. And that's where we see things like 2001: A Space Odyssey and Star Wars almost immediately after in the 1970s.
And then like UFO sightings and stuff like this are all going on during this time. So in the 70s and 80s, you get a lot of alien films like Alien and our second film, E.T. And so that's when we start looking to the stars and kind of wondering what kind of weird things are out there.
And of course, today, sci-fi is almost always dominated by computers. Computer graphics, the idea of the internet, all this new crazy technology that has been developed over the past few decades and keeps developing and keeps changing, and we haven't really wrapped our minds around it yet as a species. And we're still trying to figure it out and what its implications are. But it keeps giving us a really great opportunity to step outside of us, to go to the other and take a look at humanity from the outside. And of course, you can trace the advent of computer-based sci-fi all the way back to something like Tron and bigger ones at the turn of the century like The Matrix. But, even, I already mentioned it, but even today with stuff like Black Mirror, that's almost all based, it's like a digital Twilight Zone, really.
Yeah. Except only the dark episodes of Twilight Zone.
Yes. None of the happy, cheery ones.
Which there were plenty of. I don't think people recognize that often enough.
Yeah, everyone always just thinks of the monster on the plane.
Right, exactly. Which is a great one. But talking about today, we're going to start off with The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951, directed by Robert Wise, who also directed Sound of Music, West Side Story, one of the Star Trek films. The first Star Trek film?
The first Star Trek film.
So that's another sci-fi, but it's kind of that just those top movies that he directed definitely show his range from two of the greatest musicals ever made to a couple of the greatest science fiction films ever made.
Right, and our second film today is E.T., the Extra-Terrestrial, from 1982, directed by Steven Spielberg, who is making his first appearance on the podcast since our first episode. All the way back
insane.
there, like 46 episodes ago. Man, it's been a while. But anyway, this was definitely a critical darling. It won a lot of Oscars for specifically Best Sound, Best VFX, Best Sound Effects, and Best Original Score, as well as being nominated for several others, including Best Picture and Best Director.
And we wrap up today with Arrival from just last year, 2016, directed by Denis Villeneuve. Something, I don't know how to say it, but if you know the guy's name written out, you could probably get it from what I just said. This won at the Oscars Best Sound Editing, and it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Directing, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Sound Design. Science fiction tends to lend itself to a lot of categories because it often involves a lot of effects and creating things on screen that are not real.
Yeah.
Especially alien movies.
And I think I can agree after this week. I think I can say after this week that I agree with all the people who say that Amy Adams was kind of ripped off with not even getting a nomination for Best Actress.
Yeah, she did a really good job.
Yeah, but we already did a whole episode on how awards are they just don't matter, but they're cool if you get them.
And we talked about what did win the 2016 Best Picture. So go check that episode out.
Yeah, man. Wow. We are shilling out our own episodes hard this episode. Good for us.
Yeah. So let's get started with another episode that I'm sure will be referenced many times later.
Oh, yeah, plenty. Entire genre. So let's talk about our films in depth today. And our first one is a sci-fi classic from the 1950s sci-fi golden era, The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951. Jonathan, do you want to talk about that one for us?
I do indeed. So The Day the Earth Stood Still begins, as all three of these films do, with a spaceship landing on Earth. And so, of course, everyone flocks to go see what is up with this spaceship. News is being broadcast all over the world. And out steps a creature who looks conspicuously like a human in a spacesuit, and he takes off his helmet, and it is a human. But he also pulls out a little device held in the hand, and it looks kind of like a weapon. And so, obviously, the human military shoots him, simultaneously hitting the weapon and his shoulder. Don't ask me how that happened. And so at that moment, a much larger figure emerges from the spaceship, which is in fact a robot about 8 or 9 feet tall. And the robot opens a little visor and laser melts the guns in the hands of the American military. So after this, the alien man is taken to a hospital where he's looked at and basically quarantined. And the alien tells them that he's here to help the world and to basically bring peace to the Earth and teach them the ways that they have done that in their own society. But he's being quarantined because people are freaking out and are obviously very scared. But he ends up slipping away and ends up at this little bed and breakfast.
A boarding house.
Yeah. And he gets a room. He looks like a normal person, so there's nothing intimidating about him. And he ends up kind of touring around Washington, D.C. with a little boy. And
yes, I sometimes like to call this movie Mr. Alien Goes to Washington.
Yeah, there's a lot of very similar scenes, and honestly, I haven't checked this yet, but I'm pretty sure there are some shots at the Lincoln Monument that are almost exactly from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yeah, that was the scene where I was like, oh, this is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but with an alien.
Yeah. So through this little boy, he kind of learns more about humanity, and the little boy leads him to what he calls the smartest man in the world, who is a mathematician that lives in the area, thankfully. And the alien, who calls himself Carpenter, he goes and sees a whiteboard that the mathematician had been working a problem out on, and he solves it for him to get his attention. And after he discusses with the mathematician, he explains who he is and why he's here. The mathematician is willing to help him by getting world leaders, because the alien says that there is a message he has for everyone in the world, and he won't tell it to just one person. He needs everyone to hear it at the same time. So the mathematician agrees to contact all people from all over the world to come and listen to him. But he needs to send a message to get everyone's attention, something that's not going to hurt people, but will make the whole world pay attention. And so Carpenter's plan is to stop all electrical and mechanical processes for half an hour on a specific set day and time. And he does this at some point, and tries to convince the boy's mother that he is who he says he is. So throughout all this, at some point, the boy's mother's boyfriend tips off the police about where the alien is. He almost dies, but eventually does get his large audience and gives his very powerful speech about, how to promote cooperation and peace and what they've done on their planet. And after he's given this speech, he leaves. And it kind of leaves you with a, so what now? What is our course of action after this? We know that war doesn't work. We know there's a better way, but can we all come together to make it happen?
Yeah. We're going to talk a lot today about the idea of these sci-fi films posing big societal, big humanitarian questions. And by ending your movie on the note of what comes next, it's up to you, it's up to all of humanity, pointing the finger back at the audience is a really good way to sink that home, to make it all about that question of like, this is your world, and you get to decide its future. And plus, the whole entire movie leading up to that point is more or less this alien, this outsider, touring Earth and seeing what it's all about. Of course, he's trying to see what Earth is about all through the lens of Washington D.C. circa 1950, but still, like they make an effort to give this overview of what human nature is and its ups and downs as he interacts with various characters throughout his stay on our lovely little planet.
Yeah, so there's actually kind of a couple phases of the film that go into different themes that we're going to talk about through the other films, which the first being the ship landing and people's reaction to that and their initial fear and just kind of franticness, and what happens when suddenly there's an outside force, and suddenly when the alien gets away, like how people react to that. And that will go into our featured Twilight Zone episode that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then there is the tour of DC with the little boy, and how children are typically more accepting and more, I guess, initially friendly to a new person or a new creature or whatever than the adults tend to be. And then leading up to the themes of jealousy with the mom's boyfriend, and finally kind of getting everyone together, and again this little posed question. But I guess at the beginning, when the ship lands and suddenly there's all these tabloids and things like this, like how are we long for this world, the aliens have come, and kind of showing this robot creature that just kind of stands guard at the ship the whole time, but we know that it has some kind of destructive power because it destroys all the weapons. And so they're like very graphic images of the robot attacking cities and UFOs coming and all this kind of stuff. And that, I guess we go ahead and bring it in here, but that goes into the Twilight Zone episode, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, I believe season 1, episode 22. All the episodes we'll be talking about are available on Netflix if you want to go watch them. There will be spoilers, so do that.
Yes. And you, lovely audience, are probably wondering, along with me, whether or not Jonathan had that written down or if he just knew it. It could be
that
either one.
Honestly, I know. The other two I don't.
There you go. There's your answer. He just knew it.
Yeah, but in that episode, there's not even a blatant like showing of an alien arriving. There are just strange things that start happening in this little neighborhood, and suddenly everyone starts pointing fingers at everyone else. Like, oh, you did something weird this one time. You must be an alien. And this goes around all, like, through everyone. Like, someone's car will start when everyone else's are dead, or someone's lights will flicker. And it's just this whole finger-pointing, muckraking kind of a scenario with one of the characters actually being killed. And it ends, again, spoilers, go watch the episode before listening to this. It ends with actual aliens who have been basically manipulating the technology of these people, not coming against them violently, making them turn on themselves. And that's literally what happens at the beginning of this movie, is without any like actual provocation. All that's happened is weapons have been taken away from the army, and people have just immediately begun turning fingers on each other and just starting this whole like chaos and emergency buying of supplies and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I think one of the key parts of it is, especially in the way it's portrayed, is that it's not an irrational fear. It's not an irrational fear until you see the alien. Like up until the moment you see the alien, you're like, okay, this is scary. We don't know what's coming out of this UFO. This could be terrible. This could be bad. We could all be dead. And so you get to meet and know the alien, and then you view all of their fears as irrational. But I think the key takeaway from that is, the fear is rational, but even then you can't react in this way. It's showing you that the fear of each other, the fear of the alien is understandable, but you get to decide what comes next. Again, that question comes up. You get to decide how you react to that. Is it defensive and brutal, like you see on the Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, or is it open and questioning? It's a hard balance to strike. It's a hard thing to come up with, but sci-fi is about posing those hard questions.
And another thing that's kind of raised at the beginning of the movie is a question of transparency. And this will come back in Arrival, but basically the fact that the government and the army are keeping the alien that they have contained like under wraps. He wants to get out and experience American culture and get to know the people that he's addressing, so he knows how to best approach them. But they want to keep him quiet, keep him out of the way, and that just kind of heightens this sense of chaos. If the government had given him a platform, put him on television or something, they would have seen that he was not this terrible person. But and part of it is reasonable. He was asking for a global audience. That was very hard to do, especially in 1951. You can't just put everything that he says on Twitter and suddenly everyone in the whole world can see it instantly. But it's this thing of, if the public had had more information, would they have had as much fear? Because the unknown is what's scary. So the more you know about this new thing, the less fearful you become. So I don't know. It's not delved into super deeply in this film, but it is another thing that's raised. And then, like I said, the second part of the film, where he's touring the U.S. and stuff, is very tender and very sweet. This is not as much as the poster kind of sensationalizes the film, and it shows the robot holding the girl and shooting lasers out of its eyes, which both of those things happen at two different times in the film. It is not like an alien invasion movie in any sense. And the middle part of this is very sweet and tender, with the boy walking around and the alien trying to figure out how people operate. He gives the boy diamonds for $2 because diamonds are his currency and he has tons of them.
Yeah, they're like pennies to him.
Right. And so, another Twilight Zone episode that comes to mind in this section is The Fugitive, season 3, episode 25. I had to look that one up, I'm sorry to say. But that episode is about an old man who happens to be an alien, but he's good friends with this young girl who they play and have fun and all this stuff. And, it's just a very tender alien and child relationship, which we're going to see in E.T., and showing how children are more ready to befriend than to fight whenever they come into contact with a stranger or something new. They want to investigate. They don't want to subdue. And I think that that's another really interesting aspect of this film. And then about this time in the movie is when we're meeting the mom's new boyfriend. Her husband had died in the war, and there's a very tender moment at Arlington Cemetery, where the boy shows the alien the grave of his father, who died in World War II. And again, golden age of sci-fi comes after World War II, and the alien is asking how this happened, and the boy says, well, aren't there cemeteries on your world? And he says, yes, there are, but not for hundreds and thousands of people who died in a war. It's all just natural death because they've gotten away with it in that utopian society. So that's just another element that's all thrown into the mix.
Yeah, and so we should really talk about the context in which this film was made. Because this is the height of the black and white sci-fi era. This is the height of the golden era. It's also, I wouldn't say it's the height of the Cold War, but it's definitely the start of the Cold War, the mid 20th century, the mid 1900s. The nuclear bombs were dropped like 6 years before this movie came out. So it's very much rooted in this period of the sci-fi golden era, where sci-fi films were mostly black and white. I think they started to be some color towards the end of the 50s, as more money went into them. And they mostly revolved around this idea of nuclear energy, when we're talking about the technology, at least. And they do, there's one part in this film where the boy wonders what that UFO is powered by, and the alien, who is at that point incognito, is like, well, it's like a small nuclear generator, basically, that runs that UFO. So everything is based on this idea of nuclear technology, and the idea of what could be accomplished with nuclear technology propels some of the fantasy that you see in these films. But of course, the Cold War itself, the mistrust and polarization that is really just amped up to 11 in the world at this point in time, just permeates throughout this film. And the idea that war is bad, we just got out of World War II, and we should not do that again. That is a bad thing. We should not do that again. Just ooze out of this film.
Yeah, and in a lot of sci-fi, we'll talk about that with E.T., but even again, throughout the Twilight Zone, there's so much nuclear fear, and I think nukes are the impetus for the golden age of sci-fi in every medium, in literature and film and television. That is the worst weapon that humanity has ever created, and is just pure fodder for what could happen with these things. And thankfully there has not been another demonstration like the end of World War II, but it's still a present danger. And especially going into the Cold War, there's just so much what could happen, and what would it take to get rid of these, or what would it take to remove this fear from the world? And apparently the answer is aliens, because it's just a part of life that we have to deal with now. And sci-fi as escapism kind of is trying to show that if we don't do this, there's nothing besides some kind of outside force that can save us from these terrible, terrible weapons.
And it's weird to say, but because I was born in the 90s, but whenever I watch a film from this period, I kind of feel nostalgic. But it's a weird kind of nostalgia, because obviously I wasn't there, but because it's so, because it oozes its time period, and because it has oozed its time period for decades now, it's become heavily associated with the time period itself, this 1950s black and white movie, the kind you see some character watching on TV in another film, typically the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or something of that ilk. Good ilk, not bad ilk, good ilk. You associate it with the time period in which it exists so deeply, because it's so reliant upon the context in which it is created, that it kind of time capsules the time period it was made in, and becomes this lasting time capsule, this lasting reflection of the period in which it was made. More so, I think, than other genres, because it's so reliant on the technology it was made in, because it was so reliant on the political conflicts that were the political and societal conflicts that were the big topics of the day it was made in. And so it carries those forward, and it's like revisiting that time period almost when you watch a film like this.
And yet, another interesting thing about 50s and 60s sci-fi is, yes, they are kind of soaked in the time period, but also just from a story perspective, they're so timeless because, like we said, because they're looking at universal themes that really never go out of style. And the 50s and 60s are such a perfect kind of time to encapsulate because it's very, the clothing is so standardized. Everyone's wearing suits and stuff like that. It's not something that's going to go out of style necessarily. But it's this kind of timeless and universal fashion. Sure, the technology has changed, but there's nothing in this film that is technology dependent. There are guns, there are tanks. We still have guns and tanks as primary weapons. The alien brings a new weapon that can't really go out of style because it's a fictional weapon. So there is a sense that this story will live on and never feel like super dated or irrelevant, especially because we still have war. And that's kind of the whole point of the film is humanity needs to find a way to eradicate war, whether it be giant robots that take away our self-governance or some other plan of action. But also you mentioned the height of black and white science fiction, and that is something that is done so beautifully here. Like when black and white, especially science fiction black and white, is pulled off, it's just so like science fiction is so wrapped up in black and white because of this time period, because of the golden age. And there are some great shots in this, like specifically when Carpenter walks into the boarding house and everyone turns around and looks, and he's in the doorway completely silhouetted just by the lighting being in the foyer, and he's standing just outside of it, and he takes one step and it illuminates his face, and it's just the most perfect example of classic black and white and what black and white is used for, to show, as we've talked about with so many black and white films, is a contrast. And human versus alien is one of the biggest contrasts that you can think of. But black and white is not the only way to do good science fiction, and the next two that we're going to talk about are not black and white, although Arrival kind of gets close to it in ways that we'll talk about. But with E.T., we're going back to the child and alien relationship and making it the subject of an entire film. So Alex, tell us about E.T.
Okay, so this is a weird movie to explain because I feel like almost everybody has pretty much seen this movie, or at least most film fans have managed to see this movie. And if you haven't seen this movie, then you've probably at least seen a specific reincarnation of this film that features an alien that's not really an alien and really likes Eggo waffles. Which draws heavily from all of Spielberg's work, but especially from this film. I mean, just look at the sheer amount of bike riding in this.
E.T. or Stranger Things Season 1.
Right. So E.T. is the story of a boy and an alien, and we open with the alien. The alien is on an expedition to a planet with some of his alien buddies. We don't really know anything about him. They don't get into why he's here, although they do show them collecting plants. So we have our aliens on Earth. They look like little raisins mixed with, I'm just going to say it, turds. But
mixed with the baby from Eraserhead?
Yeah, actually. Yeah, it totally is, isn't it?
Yeah.
But all that put together, it oddly comes out cute. Which I kind of chalk up entirely to the size of its eyes. But anyway, he is on this expedition with his pals, his co-workers maybe. I don't know if they're friends outside of work. They are collecting plants, and then we see these mysterious people identified by a man who is wearing a keychain on his belt, and that's really all we see of him for the first large chunk of the movie, are going through the woods seemingly looking for these aliens, and the aliens leave, they run away, and everyone gets away except for E.T. Poor E.T. is left on Earth, and he's running away from the men who are chasing him, and he kind of falls down into the suburb. And then we see our main human character, Elliot. He is a young boy, maybe 10, somewhere around there, with an older brother, a younger sister, and a mom. They have a dad. The dad seems to have left the family. I believe they're divorced, and he's off with his girlfriend in Mexico. Clearly not easy on the mom, and it doesn't seem to be very easy on the children either. But we see the kids playing D&D. Shocker. Where else have we seen kids playing DVD or D&D in a sci-fi
in the very first
thing?
Scene?
In the very first scene. Okay. Anyway. I knew there were connections, but watching this again, I was like, wow, there are a lot of connections.
It's so similar.
So similar. But anyway, Elliot at one point is asked to go get pizza. He goes out to go get the pizza. He goes out into the back. He gets distracted by a noise in a shed out back behind the house. Of course, we've seen this again in the first episode of Stranger Things. And he runs into E.T., and he is spooked by whatever's in the shed. He runs inside to get his family. They come back out. They don't see anything in the shed. And after everybody goes back inside, E.T. wanders out, and we know, okay, E.T. is here. But Elliot is interested and confused as to what this creature is, what is going on. And he lays a trail of Reese's Pieces out in the field behind his house to try to get E.T. to come to him. E.T. comes to him, and then they kind of become friends from that point, and he tries to hide him in the house, which he successfully hides him from his mother, but he does not successfully hide him from his brother, who he shows E.T. to explicitly, and of course his little sister, who's like 4 or 5, very young, runs into E.T. as well, and they go on a series of what we like to call in script structuring business as the fun and games section of the film, where we see them do all sorts of things, like the little girl plays dress up with E.T. and there's
Stranger Things,
right? Like explicitly like the same wig and outfit that Eleven wears. Anyway, we also see that E.T. and Elliot are connected in some way. I'm not sure at what point that happens, that they forge a connection, but they do seem to be weirdly connected. Like E.T. is drinking at home while Elliot's at school, and Elliot gets drunk at school.
Yeah, that first of all, that is kind of an 80s thing that would not usually be in a children's film nowadays. But also, I was trying to think of when that moment of connection happens, and I wanted to say it was when E.T. healed Elliot's finger, but I think that happens later.
Yeah, that happens later. Yeah.
So I really, aside from Elliot finding him first, I have no idea what would have caused that, which is strange. But besides the point.
Yes, so Elliot and E.T. are connected somehow. The kids are talking with E.T., and throughout the course of the series of kind of fun escapades that we see, they learn that E.T. is stranded on Earth. He's not from Earth. He's from another planet. They learn that E.T. has the power of telekinesis. And
Stranger Things.
Yeah, and the little girl also learns that E.T. has the power to seemingly heal or bring some things back to life. Like he routinely brings this potted flower back to life throughout the course of the film, which, like, wow, this family's really bad at taking care of this one potted flower, but to let it die so many times. But yeah, it's there. It's important to the film that they're not good at gardening. But they find out that E.T. wants to phone home. Yes, he does. And so they set about building a machine for E.T. to phone home. And of course, on the night of Halloween, they execute their plan to have E.T. phone home. I'm just going to see how many times I can say phone home. Where Elliot sneaks off with E.T. into the woods and with their machine, and they're trying to signal his friends, his alien buddies, to come get him. Elliot is sick. He comes home very sick. He looks like he's dying. And of course, the older brother goes out into the woods and finds E.T. washed up by a river or a drainage ditch or something, and he looks like he has hypothermia and he's sick and dying. And of course, because they're connected, they're both sick and dying. And at this point, the kids decide they have no other choice. They bring their mom in. And of course, because she's a movie mom, she's not cool. She freaks out, which is perfectly character motivated. Like, it works. And she runs downstairs to try to get the kids out of the house, away from this poor dying creature. And who busts in then but like freaking Neil Armstrong in a NASA space astronaut outfit. It's not actually Neil Armstrong. Yeah, no, it's just a guy in like a NASA spacesuit. Because the people who are busting in are the people who are connected with the guy with the keychain, and it's never really made clear who he is, but it seems like he's working with government resources, so he's vaguely government.
I would bet that at this point in 1982, he's probably from Area 51.
Yeah. Oh, that makes total sense. Yeah. Secret Area 51. So they bust in and they are now running they are running the house. They are trying to save E.T. and Elliot at the same time while they're connected. Of course, Elliot's like screaming his head off this entire time. And like, I'm on his side, but oh my gosh.
So at this point, we realize that the humans aren't necessarily like trying to hurt E.T. They're trying to revive him, even if they're going about it the wrong way because he's an alien body.
They're trying to use like human medicine on an alien.
But Elliot is acting like they are taking a chainsaw to every one of his limbs. Like, that's how bad he's freaking out.
Yeah.
And the main guy running the show, who we thought was the antagonist at the beginning, has kind of had this little spiel where he's like, I am super interested in aliens too. Like, I'm so glad that this happened because it's been a dream of mine since I was a kid. So we realize after we've built him up as this antagonist the whole time that he's not really a bad guy.
Yeah, he might be doing things to harm the situation and create problems for everybody involved, but it's not on purpose. Right. It's not like everybody involved has like a better idea of it too. Like, Elliot doesn't know how to help E.T. right now. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't have a solution up his sleeve.
He just knows he needs to get him home, whereas the humans don't realize that there is a plan to get E.T. home.
Yes. So this is the point at which we see E.T. die, and then the credits roll and all the children in the audience cry. I'm kidding. He doesn't actually die. Elliot is left alone with the body, and apparently, and this is a theme we've seen many times before on the podcast, including Destiny from the Fritz Lang week. But love is stronger than death, and E.T. manages to revive himself because Elliot loves him so much, or at least it's implied that that's the case. E.T. isn't really dead, and they sneak him out, and this is the point where all the kids are working together, or at least the brothers are working together. Not a good idea to have your 4-year-old Drew Barrymore as as part of this bike chase. She doesn't have a lot of 4-year-olds just don't have a lot of agency. So,
but what do we have? We have bikes being chased by white vans, reminiscent of something else. Stranger Things. Man,
I feel like I've watched that before. I don't know where. Anyway,
but instead of flipping a bus,
right? I should say this chase scene with the bikes is really well done. And if you haven't seen it, I would recommend going to watch one of Spielberg's first films. I think his first feature, and it's like a TV movie too, called Duel, which is between this guy being chased by like evil truck driver who we never see, and he's trying to run him off the road in the middle of the desert, and like it's like a movie long chase scene, and it's really, really good. It's really, really well done. And you kind of see that come back here in this chase scene. It's clever and it's tense, and the power balance shifts in it are really well executed. But eventually, E.T. is like, oh yeah, I have telekinesis, and flies over some cop cars, and they get away to the woods where...
Yeah, he makes all of them fly.
Yeah, he makes all of them fly, which he didn't have to do. Like, I will say, like, E.T.'s a bro. He's like, yeah, all of you guys come along. Like, yeah, E.T.'s a great character. He's like the nicest person I've ever met who's a little alien raisin. But they get away to the woods, and this is where the spaceship has landed, where we saw it land at the earlier, like the first scene of the film. And the aliens have come. They're here to pick up E.T., and they do pick up E.T., but not before he says all of his tearful goodbyes to all of the children, including saying to Elliot that like he'll be in his head and in his heart, and like be good, which is what his exchange with Drew Barrymore's character.
Although grammatically, who knows if he knows what that means based on how he learned those words.
Right? It's true. But there's tearful goodbye. He leaves, and you get the sense that the family is closer together than they were before, and Elliot now has a little more confidence in himself than he did before. But really, like, it was a happy ending to what is borderline a kid's movie. I don't want to actually call it a kid's movie, but I would say it's a family film. It's a happy ending to a family film that is also a sci-fi a sci-fi romp at the same time, a sci-fi adventure that's full of a lot of fun and interesting and kind of zany adventures. That's almost very 80s. Like the adventures and the wackiness that they get up to is almost montage worthy. It's almost reminds me of like the stuff Ferris Bueller got up to, but with an alien.
Honestly, for a movie that doesn't have any montages in it, it's kind of, you're right. Like, I'm kind of surprised that there aren't.
Right? Like, if nothing else, just the fact that it came out in the 80s. Although it was the early 80s, and it was Spielberg. Spielberg doesn't really indulge in the montage very much.
That's true.
In like the 80s montage idea of the term, not in the Soviet montage idea of the term. Lest us belabor that point yet again.
Right. So let's start, I guess, talking thematically, because one of the things that I've already brought up that I think is interesting about this film is that this film isn't focused like our other two. It is about an alien coming down and how humans react, but it's not about a panic-inducing kind of invasion fear from the human side. It's about the curiosity and love of a child, and again, like how children are much more receptive and willing to befriend the unknown and investigate it, rather than an instinctive fear of losing some amount of power or whatever psychology goes into these alien movies, where their first instinct is to attack, regardless of how many times the alien says we come in peace. But it's just a different aspect, looking at the whole story from the child's point of view, and even just from the adult's point of view, like how there, again, isn't a pure antagonist. There is no evil character trying to, stuff E.T. and put him in a museum or put him in a zoo or something like that. It's humans who are trying to learn about the alien and kind of help him and keep him alive. But, it's not a fearful thing. It's just the conflict in the film is racing against the clock and trying to get E.T. back with his people. So that's just something that's different and unique about this film, and it's really interesting to see one that's not this oppressive. It is still kind of an internal look at humanity, but from a much more innocent and less like kind of global war kind of a political point of view.
And of course, we have to consider the context in which this film was made. And at first glance, you would say, "Oh, this is still the Cold War, like in The Day the Earth Stood Still." But that's oversimplifying things. For starters, this is the end of the Cold War, very close to the end of the Cold War. We've gotten out of the 60s and the 70s where we felt like the world was going to end every single freaking day. And we're getting very close to the point at which the Soviet Union breaks up. And we're getting closer and closer to the point in the 80s. And you see, while the Russian threat is still a thing in pop culture at this point in time, it's not quite as big or as dire or as dark as it was in the 60s and 70s and the 50s, like it was in The Day the Earth Stood Still. So, yeah, like, you know, if you go to Stranger Things, everybody always thinks that 11 is like a Russian experiment or something like that. But the threat of the Russians is always kind of kitschy at this point. Like, it's an experiment. It's something like that, rather than, they're dropping bombs on us right now, like in something like Doctor Strangelove, or think of like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So to sum up, my point is that we are definitely in a different political context here, and also the movie format is completely different in the 1980s than it is in the 1950s. Something we've mentioned many times before in the podcast: the studio system breaks up in the 60s. It's no longer a thing. We go through an artsy period in the 60s and the 70s, and then we come back around after Star Wars happens to this big budget blockbuster trend that starts with Jaws and Star Wars, and then really explodes in the 80s, and is still really under the guiding hands of Steven Spielberg, who's the director of this film, lest you forget, and George Lucas, who are really at their height in this point in time and collaborating on a lot of things and giving each other nods. I mean, in the course of this film, E.T. runs into a kid dressed as Yoda on the Halloween night. And by night, I mean afternoon, because apparently they trick or treat during the day.
Yeah, and at the beginning of the film, during your quote-unquote fun and games section, there's a whole solid like minute of Elliot showing him all of his Star Wars action figures and like describing who they are and stuff like that. And this film comes out between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. So Star Wars isn't even finished yet, and they're already like throwing merchandise and stuff like that in there. And also, I'm going to throw in the description just for fun, the fan theory that E.T. and Yoda are from the same universe, because there's a bunch of little Star Wars connections in this film, so people kind of lump them together, which may or may not have actually been part of Spielberg and Lucas's plan, but it's kind of a lot of fun.
Heck, the universes Lucas builds are so amorphous, I wouldn't rule it out. And I do want to go back and just explain the fun and games section real quick. And so it's a screenwriting term. And it comes from a particular set of theories that some people really abide by, some people don't, and I don't want to get into whether or not they're good or they're bad, but I can say that they do really apply to these 1980s blockbusters, at least most of them, and I do think it applies to E.T. really well. But the section that of a film that you could consider fun and games is between the 30-minute mark and the 60-minute mark. The point at which you've already entered the unknown fantastical universe. So in this case, like Elliot and E.T. are already friends. They're hanging out. They're doing interesting things together. And all of the other siblings are in on it too. And it ends around the 60-minute mark, around the halfway point of the film, where things kind of take a shift to the worse, and bad things start happening. But it's also kind of the promise of the movie. It's all of the really fun, exciting stuff that you go to see. This is where like all of the trailer moments come from. So whenever you see a trailer for a movie and you're like, oh, that looks really fun, or you think that looks really dramatic, or you think that looks really scary, they're probably going to pull stuff from this section of the film. Probably because this is the section of the film in which you've already gotten to the extraordinary, and you've left the ordinary that you started the film in, and you've gone to the extraordinary. So you have interesting stuff to look at, but it's also early enough in the film that you haven't gotten to the spoilerific parts yet. You haven't gotten to anything that's going to ruin the movie if you've seen it, except most trailers just kind of spoil films these days. I don't know what that's all about, but there you go.
That's a conversation for another day.
That's a definite conversation for another day. But that's what the fun and games section is, and it's very true in a lot of these, a lot of the 1980s blockbusters, and just in general, to take it back to the episode theme in sci-fi, it's going to be a really interesting, fun section of the film. It's the section in The Day the Earth Stood Still where our alien is walking around seeing all of the seeing all these interesting things on Earth that he hasn't seen before and trying to understand the culture, and we're getting to see all these really interesting comparisons. It's the section in Arrival where they learn all about the heptapods, and they're figuring it out and they're making progress. And then at the 16-minute mark, like something bad typically happens, and then you're kind of forced back into the seriousness of the plot and really trying to fix whatever problem our characters have set out to solve. And of course, that takes different forms depending on what you're writing. And of course, some people don't abide by that theory at all. Some people say it doesn't work. So take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and another term for this section of the film, if you're using the witch's hat illustration, would be the rising action. Is kind of a more general term, because sometimes fun and games doesn't quite encapsulate, especially if you're in like a thriller or a drama kind of a story.
Oh, that's a different kind of fun and games. That's like
right.
That's a sick fun and games. It's delivering on whatever you want to see, whether it be comedy or drama or horror. So it could be messed up fun and games,
like Audition.
But there it is.
But the other story thing that I want to bring up here, because we have to talk about story when we talk about Steven Spielberg, because his films are so tight and so just like concise and wrapped up. And in episode 1, we talked a lot about the intro sequences and how he sets up his films. But in this film, I think it's interesting to look at the character introductions, which we have a great video essay about that I'll post in the blog post. But so there's different ways that the characters are introduced. The aliens we're not kind of given this very mysterious introduction to them. It's not a thing of hiding the look or anything of the aliens. It is very dark and kind of smoky throughout the whole film, but especially at this beginning part in the woods. So the alien is not hidden or made mysterious right away. However, our quote-unquote antagonist is. And like you said, we're kind of introduced to him just through this jingling keychain on his belt, which is kind of an innocuous way to introduce an antagonist. But the fact that we're not seeing his face automatically makes him mysterious and a little bit sinister, and then throwing John Williams, as always, wonderful score over it and giving this ominous kind of a feel. And then Elliot we see in his living room with his brother's friends. They're all playing D&D. So we're just kind of introduced to him right off the bat again. So again, it's this idea of the less you know, the more fear there is associated with that character. And so since we see E.T. right off the bat, there's no mystery to him. He is just kind of put out there for us to see, and we get to know his look right away. There is a little bit of obscuring him when Elliot runs into him, but that is because we jump into Elliot's perspective. And as Elliot starts off a little bit fearful before he sees E.T., we get this little cat and mouse kind of thing where we don't see E.T. Either, even though we have already seen what he looks like. So that's just kind of one of the interesting things that Steven Spielberg is really good at, is masking and revealing characters in a way that is appropriate for their part in the story. Yeah.
Cat and mouse, boy and alien. Is there really any difference?
Right.
But yeah, Spielberg is definitely one of those directors who just has that super keen instinct for for storytelling through a camera, where the camera needs to be at any given moment, what you need to be seeing as the audience. And that's a really great example of it in this film. And Jonathan, do you want to talk about the relevant Twilight Zone episode for this movie?
Yeah, so this one's a little bit more of a stretch than our other two this week. But the episode in season 3, episode 30, called Hocus Pocus and Frisbee, is another kind of fun take on aliens, where these aliens come and they're trying to learn about Earth through this guy who sits in a gas station and tells fibs all day. And so he like has built himself up to be this great person just through the stories that he tells to people, and the aliens take them as true and brings them to his spaceship, and then they realize that he really doesn't know anything and he escapes. But then he goes and tells all his friends, and they don't believe that he was actually abducted by aliens because he's so, he tells so many fibs. And that's a little bit like Elliot, because it's such a strange thing that like he has an alien that, until people see it, they don't really believe it. And another one, another Twilight Zone is, again, The Fugitive from season 3, episode 25, because again, that's that alien child relationship, and how a nice alien can be perceived by children and form this bond. And one more thing I want to say about E.T., which I think is interesting as we move into Arrival, is the fact that in E.T., the alien has to learn human language to communicate with the people. And that I feel like is a trope in other movies that we're not talking about today, but think of things like the Iron Giant and stuff like that. It's kind of humans gesticulating and saying words, and then the alien or other creature is repeating them back. And that happens a lot in E.T., whereas in Arrival, we're going to see the flip side of that and how you can create a very interesting story by learning a fictional language.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the Iron Giant. I was actually thinking about this week, because the main character in Iron Giant actually watches an old black and white science fiction film on his TV, and it reminded me a lot of The Day the Earth Stood Still.
And in E.T., whenever they're investigating the weird occurrence in the shed, one of the kids goes doo 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 doo, just to bring everything home.
Right. It's almost like they knew one day we would be making this podcast and Jonathan would want to make a Twilight Zone reference.
Perfect.
Well, it looks like we've arrived at our last film for the day. So Jonathan, do you want to take us into Arrival from 2016?
Yeah, let's shift our gravity a little bit and get into this movie. So Arrival starts, shocker, with aliens arriving on Earth. Who knew? And these aliens arrive in 12 different spots around the world, all at the same time. And so simultaneously, the world freaks out. And there's a big panic, and we follow this linguistics professor at a college. What was it, Berkeley?
Yes, Berkeley.
And she comes to class, and in a really great way to set up exposition, she walks past a bunch of students watching the TV, and she walks into class, and there's hardly any students there. There's like 5. And as she just like begins speaking, they're all getting notifications, and one of them says, could you turn on the TV? And then we watch the exposition news. If anyone follows the Script Notes podcast, they've been talking about how whenever you're setting up exposition through a newscast, someone should parody that and just say, this is exposition news. Anyway.
Or at least do it Edgar Wright style.
I know, right? So they watch the exposition news and find out about all of these ships that have landed. And a couple minutes later, the army knocks at the door of our linguistics professor's office. And they're like, hey, you did some work for us over in the Middle East. So here is this recording we took of the aliens. Can you decipher it for us? And she's like, no, I cannot from your little warbled recording device. I need to be there. And he's like, you can't be there. This is a top secret. Eventually, she ends up going there, and she meets with Jeremy Renner, who is what does he do?
He's a
scientist man.
He's a generic scientist. I mean, that's really his point.
Yeah, I know.
But
set
like,
up
we don't
with,
need to know.
With like a really kind of tropey. He's reading her book in which her thesis is that language is the basis of society, and he's like, ha ha ha, that's great, except science is the basis of society. And so, like, in 2 sentences, we have the basis of their character relationships. So they are brought on to decipher why the aliens are here and what we can learn from them or teach them or whatever through various little sessions when they go up into the alien ship, and they can see them through this glass. And eventually, Amy Adams' character determines that they can write things on boards, and then the aliens will spurt some kind of ink or something, misty ink that comes up to this glass partition and forms a circle.
They have really good atmospheric haze machines built into their arms. They're essentially a practical VFX person's dream.
Yeah. And Spielberg would love to have one of them on his sets to just constantly be filling the scene with haze. But besides the point. So they create these circles with little outcroppings and stuff like that. And the fact that their writing is circular becomes very important. So through the film, they learn how to read this writing. And a central tenet of the film is the fact that learning how to communicate changes the way that you think. And since the heptapods, as they call them, because they have 7 legs, Greek hepta, 7, pod, leg or limb.
That is actually narration in the film.
Yeah, like, that's a line in the film.
Jonathan's quoting. He's not like a Greek nerd. Well, actually, no, I take that back. He is a Greek nerd, but that's not part of this podcast.
So, since the heptapods can write, I think they call it in the film nonlinear orthography, where basically the way they describe it is they can write a sentence from both ends, so they know exactly what words they're going to say the entire time and how much space is needed in between, which becomes very important because our main character starts having these flashbacks and starts thinking in a different way. And I really don't want to spoil this movie because it's really enjoyable to watch unfold. So I'm going to try and leave it vague, but it's about learning how to communicate with the aliens and how that leads humanity to communicate with itself, because each of the pods has a certain set of information, and all of the countries where the pods have landed have to convey the information that they have learned to each other and get this whole global collaboration thing going on. And yet,
which let me just say real quick, they say that the pods landed spread out evenly across the Earth, but all of the positions they showed were in the northern hemisphere, except for like the one by Australia. Just want to throw that out there.
I don't think they said evenly. I think they said randomly.
Okay,
I may be wrong.
I'll take randomly.
But yeah, so it goes into a lot of the things that we've been talking about, where it's about finding a way to create some kind of universal collaboration. And this film does a really good job of interestingly portraying a way that could potentially happen. I mean, in a fantasy universe, but something like this that just is something that everyone has to figure out. And yet throughout it, there's a point where at the beginning, everyone is kind of basically Skyping each other. So everyone's keeping each other up to date until some of the countries become militant against the aliens, and then they stop sharing information. And that's when things all go haywire. So there's a lot wrapped up to this film. And I think is a really good example of sci-fi that gets back to the heart of classic sci-fi in an era where we've become very centered on what we can present visually and creating entire movies, science fiction movies that are just visual extravaganzas and without a lot of thoughtful investigation.
Yeah. And it has well, it is very pretty. It is a very pretty movie to look at. It's got a very distinct, what one might call a Villeneuve aesthetic to it, which is very heavily related to what I believe in an earlier podcast I called the 2010 short film aesthetic, like video champion short film aesthetic. Which isn't a bad thing. Like, it is a really pretty way to shoot a film. It looks great. But yes, it does go back to sci-fi roots in more than one way too. Like, it does pose these big societal questions about the way we think and the way we interact with each other, the way we communicate with each other. Are we working in our best interest when we work against each other, or are we working for our best interest when we work with each other? But also definitely getting back to kind of like this very sciencey sci-fi. Like, they don't shy away from putting a whole lot of science in here. Maybe not enough to satisfy a scientist, but for us two film majors over here, we're like, wow, that's a lot of science. That's a lot of science.
Yeah, it's not like
but like a good amount. Like, it's enough to be interesting and to feel rooted in something, but not so much that it drowns out the plot, the story, the interest of it in technicality.
Yeah, because I don't think you can do these days like The Day the Earth Stood Still, where the alien comes out and it's just a human wearing a spacesuit, and there's no explanation for that. It's just, okay, he's an alien, he speaks English, that's fine, because that's not the point of the movie. Even though that's still not the point of Arrival, I think that there has to be something more to it than that to get a film produced these days and to make it more interesting and more believable to some extent. And this is based on a short story, which I think we should bring up. It has been changed in certain aspects, and there's a video essay that we can include in the blog post that goes into that a little bit more. But it's just another interesting point to the sci-fi that you have to give some amount of explanation. You can't just make it only based on the societal things like The Day the Earth Stood Still, where all the science is kind of not even touched upon. It just focuses on what the film is about.
Yeah, and part of that is kind of like our cultural, I guess, penchant now for nitpicking apart science and practicality in films.
Yeah.
And part of that's good. Part of it makes for better storytelling, tighter storytelling, more logical storytelling that holds up to tough examination. But also part of it is maybe extraneous. Like, as long as it's fun, like picking apart science, especially, like picking apart the science in a film can be a lot of fun as long as you're doing it in the spirit of fun. But once it hits the point where it's like, where you got this one scientific principle wrong, and why are you doing this wrong? You shouldn't be allowed to make this movie. At that point, like, it's just not fun anymore, and it's just not worthwhile, because there has to be a suspension of disbelief. And while there is a lot of scientific rooting in a film like Arrival, there's also like not a lot of explanation about some things. And of course, that's because it's not just science; it's science fiction. Like, we're never explained how the aliens can shift gravity in their spaceship, and we don't need an explanation. Because we've earned it from a story perspective, because these are aliens who have landed on Earth, and the fact that they can shift the gravity within their spaceship really doesn't seem like that big of an achievement compared to them making it to Earth in a spaceship, because we all know how hard it is to get between planets.
Yeah, and I think that one clarification that might be useful as far as this discussion is a distinction that Ray Bradbury made between science fiction and science fantasy. And all of these films fall solidly in what he would consider science fantasy. He says that the only science fiction book he ever wrote was Fahrenheit 451, because that is a story that could potentially happen. There could be a society where all literature and books and things like that are banned and burned, because that has no fantastical elements to it. Whereas anything else like the Martian Chronicles or Illustrated Man, all of that is science fantasy. And all of these, by the nature of aliens, fall into the science fantasy genre. There is like the most minuscule chance that, like, even if there were aliens, which I don't think is possible, there is practically zero chance that we have guessed how they look or interact in any of the bajillion alien movies that have ever existed. So, just understanding that these films are not meant to portray reality, but to give a hint of reality in order to show a more internal and thematic reality rather than a physical and scientific reality.
Yes, although talking about reality, we should talk about the weird structure of this film. Which honestly, like, whenever people talk about the time structure of this film, and it is impressive, and it is surprising, so we don't want to get into the nitty-gritty details of how it relates too specifically to the story, but it doesn't play a super large part into the way the story is told, so much as it plays a part of how the theme is conveyed. And it goes back to that thing you mentioned earlier, Jonathan, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, where learning a language can actually rewire your brain and restructure the way you think. And that's what happens to one of our main characters over the course of the film. She starts to think, as she learns the language that the aliens are teaching them, she starts to think a little differently, which, again, I was about to do the thing where I start to poke holes in it, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense, but it works. However it works. And when she starts thinking differently, she starts moving around time, essentially, moving around her own life and experiencing memories or events, you could call them, or visions of the future at certain points of the film. And as she bounces around, the film bounces around too between them all. And as we've explored before on this podcast, jumping around time like that can be a very hard thing to do, a very hard thing to keep straight on screen, and make sure it makes sense to your audience. While at the same time probably not making sense to your characters, especially when they're really conscious that they're jumping around in time, as our character in Arrival is, and is disoriented by the process. Although, credit to her, like, she picks it up pretty quick.
Yeah, but that's why, as complicated as time rearranging is, that's what makes stories that are able to pull it off well, or at least compellingly, are so interesting. So this movie brings me back a lot to Shane Carruth, both with Primer and the time jumpiness, and also with Upstream Color, in the way that the memories and the thought processes are embedded into the film without explanation until you kind of have to unravel it as you go along. And even like stuff like Memento and The Prestige, where, you're revealing information to the audience in a way that keeps them on pace with the characters in the film, is just such an interesting way to do a story, but it's also much more difficult than just portraying the story linearly and having it make sense all the way through. So yeah, this film definitely does a really good job of that, and is what makes it so interesting and so compelling to watch.
I have a question for you, Jonathan. Do you think as the aliens were learning human languages, they started to have weird visions of linear experiences?
That's a good question, Alex. And I'm going to go with no, because again, like I was talking about with E.T., this film is so much more focused on humans learning the alien language. There's no point where the aliens start to, write little English letters in their smoky ink. Or
Yeah, really. They don't
anything
meet
like
us
that.
halfway, do they?
Yeah, so that's why I think it's interesting comparing with like E.T. and the Iron Giant, whereas The Day the Earth Stood Still doesn't address it at all. But, this is us trying to figure out their language where they keep just like kind of flashing stuff at us and we have to figure out what it means, as opposed to us flailing and pointing at things, which there's a little bit in this movie, but it doesn't come to the point where the aliens are spouting out bird or Luis or whatever like that.
Yeah. Heptapod phone home.
Exactly.
And of course, we have to talk about the context of this film because that's something we've been talking about for all the films. And of course, if you look at it from technology perspective, there's digital technology. They're using like a iPad and a big hooked up monitor and all sorts of fancy stuff to communicate with the aliens. But if you look at it from the political perspective, from the societal perspective, all of the countries are having a hard time communicating with each other. No one seems to really trust anybody. Everybody's motives are more or less unknown, and we don't know how somebody's going to act next. And that's kind of like the political world we live in now. Like this is the post Cold War, post 9/11 world of mistrust and like kind of like unknown shadowy enemies with unknown shadowy motivations that we live in. And whenever you put it in a movie, you have to amp it up. And that's
in
what
one
we have
sense,
here.
this is like it's kind of a modern The Day the Earth Stood Still, in the sense that the aliens come down and they have a message for the whole world. And in an era where we can easily get a message to the whole world like immediately, but we don't. We still have to. It's not enough for everyone to hear the message. Like everyone has to collaborate to understand the message. So all the aliens come in at several different points, as opposed to one point where everyone has to gather in America to learn about this. That's kind of another interesting point of kind of how do you adapt the same kind of story of aliens with a helpful message for the whole world into an era where messages can get around the world very quickly.
Right. How do you still have that stumbling block from a plot perspective, where they can't communicate? And really, like it's not that hard of a stumbling block to conjure up because just make a country not trust another country, and that is easy because none of them trust each other. But anyway, we should also talk about the fact that, or the role China plays in this film, kind of as a maybe villain for the first part of the film, or at least they definitely seem like an antagonist. So China kind of seems like the villain, the antagonist for the first part of the film, even though really the antagonist for the entire film is human nature. But anyway, they almost end up being the savior country towards the end of the film, in the resolution. And I don't have proof of what I haven't bothered to look up the distribution deals of this film, but it has been a trend to kind of work to gain introduction into the Chinese market lately. They have a huge population. They love blockbusters, so you see a lot of big blockbusters these days pairing up with Chinese production and distribution companies to gain access to the Chinese market, and they only give access to so many American films per year. So it's possible that that is that is a motivation for why China ended up being such a big role player in this movie. Of course, it's also possible that they are just a huge world superpower at the moment, and that makes sense on considering the scale of world politics that were occurring in this film. I should have looked this up, but I didn't.
Yeah, I definitely think it's something that may come up later on in the podcast. So it's interesting to bring up now that in a lot of modern films, some that jump out to me is like Gravity and The Martian. China ends up being a country that steps in to help America out of their crisis. in especially these big kind of space epics and stuff like that. So I think that there is some merit to this kind of appeasing this country that could have a huge impact on box office. But we will come back with more solid research about this fact later on.
At some point.
Something that we do have knowledge about is the Twilight Zone. And our featured episode for Arrival, which is probably our best link, is called To Serve Man, Season 3, Episode 24. And seriously, go watch that episode on Netflix before you continue listening, because that episode has a huge spoiler, which I'm about to talk about. Because in To Serve Man, an alien arrives on Earth and has all this technology that they can provide to Earth and help them erase war and famine and create abundance and plenty. And he does all that. And then all the humans start going off to his planet because it's great. But he has left behind. He dropped off whenever he showed up at the UN to provide all this stuff. He dropped a book. And so two characters, a man and a woman again, work throughout the film to decipher what the book means. They just find it interesting that it's a different language and they're trying to figure it out. They're not super skeptical. They're a little bit, but they realize that the book says to serve man, and that's exactly what the aliens are doing. They're serving mankind. And it's not till the end of the film when they realize that to serve man actually is a recipe book about how to fry up and cook humans to eat. And this is like the opposite of Arrival, where it's another story of deciphering and learning an alien language. And even Arrival brings up this idea that you have to completely understand a language and the different nuances of grammar and structure to not misinterpret what someone is saying and cause a huge problem by doing so. And that's exactly what happens in this story, except instead of an Arrival where the aliens literally are there to serve man because they're going to need man's helps in the future. Spoiler alert, we're about to get into overall notes. That may have been a little preemptive. But yeah, instead in this Twilight Zone episodes, they misinterpret the meaning and it becomes very disastrous. That's a great episode. Go check it out.
Yes. If you haven't guessed, free plug of the week is The Twilight Zone.
All of it.
Literally all of it. Go watch all of that.
All right, but with that, let's get into our overall notes. So the main thing we've been talking about with all of these films, which is super important for proper or classic sci-fi, is how a film looks at humanity from the outside, taking a step back and saying, like, how would someone who has had no experience with humanity, not just American culture, but with the way that humanity interacts interculturally, internationally, view us, and seeing how, on the flip side of that, humans interact with something that they have no experience with. And we see that from the point of view of people who don't know that they are in the presence of an alien. We've seen that from the point of view of children in E.T. and from the point of view of a scientific and militaristic angle in Arrival. So it's a really interesting way to look at how these same themes keep popping up in three completely different time periods, and how, again, proving how this genre and even this subgenre of science fiction is constantly relevant, because we are constantly looking at ourselves and trying to improve ourselves through our storytelling.
Yeah. The only thing that could radically change this subgenre of science fiction is if aliens actually land on Earth.
Right.
Because the moment that happens and we know about it, then this is no longer science fiction. It's just like a regular drama movie. Like, it's just regular old drama movie, just happens to have aliens in it. It happens. Yeah. Yeah. And it's something I don't think we got a chance to talk about a lot today because none of the films we spoke about were particularly groundbreaking in this area. But science fiction provides a really great frontier for pushing the boundaries of special effects. And if you go back to another film we've talked about on the podcast before, Star Wars, and the founding of ILM with George Lucas, that's a big push forward in special effects. And we're even seeing the same thing nowadays. Of course, we might not be. Depends on if the next Avatar movie ever comes out. But James Cameron loves to push technology, especially camera technology and computer graphics technology. And the best sandbox, the best genre in which to really push that idea is science fiction, because you can really mess around with technology. It's a genre that requires a certain amount of innovation, a certain amount of technical savvy, a certain amount of willingness and necessity to go beyond just shooting a regular scene, a standard scene, which isn't necessarily easy to do, a standard scene, but it goes beyond to be willing to do flying saucers and flying bikes and flying heptapods, literally to name the 3 films we did today. They require that little extra something that make the genre special.
Yeah, and like you said, none of these are groundbreaking, but they are solid examples of the technology that we had at the time. Like even the day the Earth stood still, I was kind of impressed with some of the special effects, like where the robot disintegrates the tanks and stuff, because it didn't just it made them glow and disappear, but it wasn't just like, oh, let's cover the screen with something and then change the shot, make it disappear. But like the glow forms the shape of the object, and then it kind of implodes in on itself and then leaves this pile of ash, which I was like, oh, hey, they actually like put a lot of detail and work into these special effects. And then we have E.T. and we have the spaceship and a lot of green screen stuff with the bike riding and stuff like that. But you have E.T. itself, who is a puppet or a creature, like we talked about a lot last week with Jim Henson. And we don't have any evidence that Jim Henson worked on E.T., but it is literally the same year as the Dark Crystal. So this is the height of animatronics and puppetry and stuff like that. And E.T. is a really great example of a creature that is created in real life, who has a lot of moving parts. His neck extends, his eyes move, his mouth moves. He waddles around super cutely, and his chest glows. There's just so many components to E.T. that it is the height of not only digital technology, like I said, with the green screen, but also physical creation and creatures. And then Arrival, of course, is very simple compared to a lot of movies coming out, like your Avatars and your Transformers and stuff like that. But it's so just beautifully well done, and like all of the special effects feel so real. Like the heptapods are kind of clouded in this mist and stuff, but we do get several close-ups of these really knuckly and fingery and starfishy looking parts of them that just look real. Like, if you were if you were an alien landing on Earth watching Arrival, you might think that those animals actually exist on Earth somewhere. But it's just another testament to how when sci-fi doesn't revel in its technology and it just uses the best of what's available without being flashy, it can provide so much more impactful stories by seamlessly using technology to present a story that's not about the technology, but it's about ourselves.
Yeah, and like many other, like all films, it's not just about the visual spectacle. It's almost entirely about story, and the visual spectacle is just part of the way that you tell that story. And the special effects are a great way to do that. E.T. should not be a cute creature. By all logic, he should not be a cute creature. Yeah, he is, somehow. And they managed to pull that off through a mix of I don't know if they'd be special effects, just effects. acting, cinematography, directing, storytelling, to make this kind of creepy looking little dude that looks like the Thing from Eraserhead unbelievably lovable and cute and amazing. And that's just orchestrating all of those elements of storytelling all together to really make a great story and make a great character. And so, yeah, if you were to just prioritize visual storytelling, you might be able to make a cute looking ET, but you want to get the same ET, the same lovable ET that had so much depth of character without being able to really speak English the entire film, as we did get in the Steven Spielberg ET.
Right. And again, like we've been talking about with all of these films, the context matters so much because science fiction is built on societal commentary and humanitarian commentary. And as long as humans have conflicts with each other, which, if history is any indication, is going to be an everlasting part of life, even as our conflicts change and we try to grow, science fiction will always be relevant because it's always a way to look at human conflict from another angle. It's taking a step back and looking at something in a different way, because clearly all the ways that we've looked at before are not, the most effective. So science fiction is going to be ever present, and as long as we can dream and imagine and hope for a better world, it's going to be a way that we can present those answers, or present some kind of answer, even if it's escapism, something that could never truly happen. It's a way for us to look forward optimistically. At least in these films, there are plenty of science fiction films that are not nearly so optimistic, but that's for another podcast.
That's for a different time.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week, we're looking at a very different genre, and that is a genre that we haven't looked at before, and that is documentaries. The films we're watching next week are Grey Gardens from 1975, The Thin Blue Line from 1988, which is available on Netflix, and finally, Grizzly Man from 2005.
Well, that's about all the time we have in this Twilight Zone.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found in the Twilight Zone at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them in the Twilight Zone at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the Twilight Zone, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about, or else we will put you in the Twilight Zone.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next Twilight Zone.
See you in the Twilight Zone.
On the outside looking in, just like you're an alien. Do 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 do. Okay, sorry.
That was good. That is going at the end of this podcast.